Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Spell. And today we have a very interesting episode. We have a philosopher all the way from Vancouver, Canada. I assume that's where you are from, David, right? Yeah.
I
Okay,
am.
cool. Yeah. So we have this philosopher all the way from there, and that's David Egan. First of all, let me thank you so much for spending your time with us, David. All the way from Vancouver. So I hope everything's good for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yes, I appreciate the invitation.
Right. Why am I having him on? So David is a really interesting guy. He's written stuff on philosophy. He's also offered online classes on philosophy, something that I plan to promote a little bit as well. Let me introduce him formally. David Egan is a public philosopher who earned his doctorate in philosophy at the University of Oxford. He's taught philosophy and humanities at Oxford, the University of Chicago, and other institutions in Canada, the US, and the UK. As I mentioned, he teaches philosophy classes online for the general public at eganphilosophy.com. He's the author of The Pursuit of the Authentic Philosophy, Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and the Everyday. David is interested in how we find and make meaning in our lives, and especially in those moments where our self-image gets punctured in revealing ways. When you look at his writings, it covers an extensive range of topics, including but not limited to existential anxiety, human animality, play, and many other things. He draws his inspiration from a wide range of philosophers, but he has this particular interest in Wittgenstein and Heidegger. David, I understand that right now you're writing a book on animals. Is that correct?
Yeah, when I have the time. I have been working on it, but sort of in fits and starts between other things. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So maybe we will get a little bit into it. So
Yeah.
I just want to give a kind of scope of what I'm looking to talk about today. One of David's online courses is called Know Thyself, it's knowledge and self-knowledge in literature and philosophy, is something which I've signed up for. I have to confess I don't read classic literature such as Sophocles, Oedipus the King, Leo Tolstoy, Oscar Wilde. It's really not my area of expertise. I'm coming in this quite blank. And if any one of you is listening out there, if you have no idea about all this classic literature, this is a good place to start because I'm going to try to take David, to explain to us lay people, why is it worthwhile or interesting to try to dive into literature, classic literature, when it comes to philosophy. So that's one. The other course that he also has is called 10 Dangerous Ideas, Introduction to Philosophy. I'm a little bit more familiar with the material that he's using for that particular course, but I just recently finished reading some of the more contemporary texts, such as Amia, Srinivisan's The Right to Sex, and Myisha's Cherries, The Case for Rage. It's books that I do recommend, something that I'm a little bit more familiar with right now, and perhaps we can talk a little bit about that with David. Aside from that, there are also many other writings that David has written for non-specialist audience. Stuff related to existential anxiety, authenticity from a Wittgenstein and Heidegger perspective, whether philosophers can be considered experts. I like actually how provocative some of your essays are titled, like "Looks are not superficial." Trump's victory shows why we need philosophy students more than ever. Perhaps we can also get into some discussion around that. And at the same time, I understand that you've traveled to Ethiopia, Iran, Myanmar. You made a pit stop in Singapore. I came across your old blog entry on that one. Again, if we have some time, maybe towards the end of the session, we can some light discussion on that. So, David, I'd just like to start first by asking you, it's something that we ask all our guests. When was the first time that you realized the world is not as it should be? And again, you can just relate this to philosophy, social issues, on the environment. Take it away.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I mean, I should say, I don't know if your audience knows this, but you very graciously sent me some of the things you'd like to talk about in advance. So I knew you were going to ask that question. I also actually, I kind of want to ask you about why you asked that question, but maybe I should start by trying to answer it. And I was thinking about this, and the first answer that came to my mind was thinking about when I was a child. I had this, I don't know if you'd call it a fantasy or something like that, but I sort of imagined that I was this baby crocodile that was falling down a very, very long well. just falling and falling. And the whole time that I was falling, I was dreaming that I was, a human boy in this world, and that, eventually I was going to reach the bottom of this well and be reunited with my crocodile mummy and daddy and stuff, and realized this whole thing had been this fantastic dream. And this wasn't like it, it was sort of it's not something I believed, but it was sort of a thought that kind of stayed with me. Like I didn't. I mean, I think children are like this. It's not really a question of do you believe, do you not believe, but is this a thought that somehow animates you or captivates you? And this is just sort of one example of, I think, many instances of in my childhood of sort of supposing that the world was radically different. I also had this weird fantasy that everybody around me were actually aliens cunningly disguised as humans, and that I didn't realize this. And I think this probably isn't uncommon among children. But I also think it's like an impulse that's very much related to like what makes grown-ups do philosophy. That sort of sense that somehow there's something more, something else going on, or at least an uncertainty about is everything the way it seems. And I think maybe one difference between people who choose to commit a significant portion of their adult life to thinking about philosophy and people who don't is that I think with some people that childhood impulse fades, and for some people it fades less. And while I don't still entertain the thought that I'm a crocodile falling down a well, I think in a way that sort of early impulse, in many ways is still present. That sort of sense of, wait, why are things the way they are, and why shouldn't they be otherwise? And I think that feeds a lot of philosophical questioning, not just my own.
Yeah, I have to say that's fascinating, because out of all the interviews that we have conducted, yours is the first one where it's not a real experience, in the sense that it's not some real event. It's a dream experience, and you're the first one to talk about that.
I should emphasize it wasn't a dream. There's this fantasy that I was dreaming, but this wasn't something I dreamed. It was sort of in my waking life. I had this thought of, how do I know I'm not a crocodile having a dream?
Right. Yeah.
And actually, you mentioned, I mean, we made at some point talk about Zhuangzi, and this is obviously long before I read about Zhuangzi's dream about the butterfly. But it's interesting that I had this.
Yeah. And well, you did ask us also, why do we even ask this as the first question? Because we while we were conceptualizing this program, we want to start with a question that speaks to why we're interested in breaking spells, right? And our show is very much predicated on the idea that we want to overturn conventional thought. And usually it comes with a certain epiphany, it doesn't have to be anything dramatic, but people can search into their childhood or into something that's more recent in their history to find that one event, right, that clicks, that make them realize that, hey, the world should be something different. So actually yours is kind of like fascinating in that sense. And actually the funny thing is also is like, you mentioned crocodile, and a crocodile is my favorite animal. I'm just wondering, like, for you, taking this thing you just described, right? So as you said, it's not necessarily a dream, but it's a kind of a fantasy. Like, how has that spurred you in your pursuit for philosophy? Because, like, to me, it sounds very much like a analogy for like the Matrix, or for something like our life is maybe a simulation. So it sounds more to me like you would have veered towards that area, like the philosophy of reality or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, one of the reasons I was interested in this idea of asking, because I assumed your question about, when was the first time you sensed that something wasn't quite as it was, as, almost a sort of question of how did you get interested in philosophy? And, there's this, I think it's both in Aristotle and Socrates, I'm not sure about this, but, this idea that philosophy begins in wonder.
Right.
And, one form of that wonder is, this isn't right. But I feel that's only one form that wonder can take. I mean, there can be a sort of an astonished sense of, how amazing that there is anything at all. I think everybody, I mean, to, actually answer your question about, if that's where I started, how did I end up where I am? I mean, I imagine it's very rare for somebody to say, this is what got me interested in philosophy in the first place, and I'm still at it. And I'm sort of thinking just anecdotally of other philosophers I know and their kind of origin stories. It could be interesting to talk about these sort of philosophy origin stories. But, when I think about how I got interested, what I got interested in that trajectory. I think there's a some continuity in the personality that I have that maybe informs these questions, but especially as you grow up, a lot depends on what you read, who you encounter. I mean, there were these encounters, with Nietzsche when I was in my late teens, like so many other late teen men, and an encounter with Wittgenstein as an undergraduate. And there are certain moments like that I think really shaped my sense of what it was to ask a question and what these questions were. And in particular, I think I've always had a sort of a love-hate relationship with philosophy. That obviously interested in enough in it to do a PhD and to care a lot about how it's done, but also, I seem always to be drawn to figures who themselves feel uncomfortable with philosophy. I mean, Wittgenstein being the obvious case of somebody who felt very uneasy in a university setting, advised all his students to abandon philosophy, and basically devoted his career to debunking most of what passed for philosophy. And so in that sense, I mean, I don't think I ever would have felt entirely comfortable just saying, here are some set traditional philosophical problems, let's go at them. Like, I just think that's never been my orientation to philosophy. And fortunately, I found my way into authors, and again, like in terms of my own just biography, most notably Wittgenstein, who sort of helped me find my own way of thinking about these things, which wasn't in terms of let's do skepticism or something like that.
Yeah, just to say for our viewers, if you don't know who Wittgenstein is, we will get into him later, and I will ask David to do a 101, essentially, because that's his doctoral thesis. So David, maybe let me just get into the nuts and bolts of it, right? So I am going to take up your course, Know Thyself, right? And how do we know that we're a human being, we're not a crocodile that's falling through a well? So you actually introduced the course with this premise that the philosopher Socrates, as you mentioned just now, he did not believe that poetry and philosophy should go hand in hand, and he wanted to banish poetry from his ideal philosophical republic. And as I mentioned just now, you're going to also utilize different texts of classic literature, such as Oedipus, Plato's Republic, excerpts from Aristotle's Poetics. So as I mentioned just now, also in the introduction, I'm someone who finds this difficult to tackle because of how the language is. It's obviously a bit ancient in that sense. But I want to hear from you, right? Like, why is it worthwhile for us? It's worth the effort to tackle and to study this kind of text, and what can we learn actually in regards to self-knowledge from studying them?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a few answers I think I could give to that, right? So one is there's a reason we still have access to these texts. Until the invention of the printing press, there were these sort of bottlenecks that things had to pass through, where anything that was going to survive on fragile media like papyrus or manuscript paper or whatever it is that they used had to be it would crumble and fall apart, and it had to be painstakingly copied out by hand, generation after generation after generation. So we've lost a lot from basically every classical civilization in terms of their literature. The stuff that survived has survived because generation after generation after generation of people thought this stuff is so important, it's worth copying it out by hand and preserving for the next generation. Which I think is a pretty strong endorsement, just to start with. There's got to be something going on there that this has reached us at all. A lot of people in a lot of different places and times have found this worth preserving. And what's more is foundational to a tradition. That if we want to just take the Greeks as one instance of this, the Greeks had profound influence on, the way the Romans thought. The Romans had profound influence on the way Christian Europe thought, and so on down. And, the way that, we in a global civilization that has been profoundly influenced by European civilization think has this mark of the influence of the Greeks in large ways and small. And in that sense, I mean, to go back to the self-knowledge issue, to understand who we are, how we think, understanding the tradition that we have inherited, I think is a really important part of that. But I think, like, in addition to all that, I think there's something really valuable about reading texts. I sort of paused there because I feel like it's not just reading text, but sort of encountering thought from contexts very different from our own. And I mean, this might tie into the question you raised about travel earlier as well. Everything that is written in the last couple of years that you have access to has been written by somebody who's shaped by the same set of influences that you are. I mean, on a very simple level, like everybody everywhere in the world right now, with maybe a few small exceptions in the Amazon jungle or something, is influenced by global capitalism. And that influences how we think in a profound way, in ways that we don't even notice. Global capitalism didn't exist when Sophocles wrote Oedipus. And that means that there are certain assumptions that we share with everybody alive today that we don't even notice that we share. And it can be, I think, bracing and informative to encounter people who are thinking in contexts that are so different from our own that, and I think this is, maybe, you were talking about sort of the difficulty of like relating to these people. And I think this is exactly the difficulty, is that they have a very different context for thinking, but that's also very much the reward. And I've taught especially, I spent 4 years teaching at the University of Chicago, where I was teaching in this course called Human Being and Citizen, which was basically like a Great Books of the West course. We started with, Homer and the book of Genesis, and we ended up, with J.M. Coetzee or other figures in the 20th century. And a lot of students would complain about, these things just aren't relatable. And I got increasingly annoyed at this term relatable, because I thought, it's not their job to relate to you, it's your job to figure out how to relate to them. And in particular, if you don't find them relatable, it means that you have to change in order to find what's here. And that sort of disciplining of yourself, of not saying, I am the customer, come serve me, but saying, I need to undergo some kind of transformation in order to figure out how this can speak to me, can be a really profound and transformative experience.
Yeah, actually, there's been a bit of recent commentary running in the press, from what I noticed, about how certain scholars are making the case that great books are important to studying. And obviously, they're referring to very ancient, well, not very ancient, I mean, just the old canon of like Western literature, and how, for example, as you mentioned, they're foundational to, say, the civilization that we live in. And at least in my case, what I've gone as far as to read is a lot of Stoicism. And Stoicism is also something that's based on, how long are we talking about? Centuries old, right? Philosophy. And yet there is parts that is very relevant, and not even just the ethics of it, like how to live, but even in terms of the metaphysics as well, as to how people used to think and how things have changed all over the years. And in that sense, yeah, I can see where by studying such texts, you really come to appreciate like how much we think of the world has evolved so much. But a lot of it, like you mentioned, I think is foundational, or there's some basis, like from how we operate metaphysically, or epistemically speaking, how we view the world. You mentioned about like your students are complaining, right? So about how they find it difficult to find the relevance. Do most of them eventually make it through at the end seeing it? It's like, they discover the beauty and the worthiness, like I mentioned about studying the text. Do they capture something out of it, or do most of them come away feel like they need to spend more time studying it, perhaps on their own, or yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like this is a good moment to say why I enjoy teaching courses online, is that, I've been doing this thing where, people just sign up to take a course, and the only reason that, I'm not a university, I don't give you any credentials, so the only reason to do it is because you're interested. One of the difficulties about teaching in university is they have to at least pretend, because they need to get the grade. Right. And they often write papers. And, sometimes it can be hard for me to judge. But yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. I don't think I could sort of go down a class list and say, everybody has been transformed by this. I think everybody, I think, in some way benefits. If they do the work, they're not going to not benefit in some way. And, people come at it from different places, come away from it with different things. But also, I mean, if we're talking just in the context of this University of Chicago course, we spend 7 class sessions on the Iliad. I had the good fortune of doing this 4 years in a row, which meant I read the Iliad 4 years in a row, and spent several weeks each year discussing it. Every time I did this, I came away with a deeper appreciation of that text. The students read it once. Hopefully they will read it again. I mean, in a way, I think one of the upsides to sort of studying the humanities in a university context isn't that, now I have read all these things, but rather now I've read all these things for the first time. And, hopefully at different points in life later on, I can come back and reread them and reread them. And what you find at different points in your life in a text is going to be different just because you're different. And, there's always a meeting happening. It's not like there's this text that doesn't change and then I come to it, but rather there's me and there's this text, we come together, and who this person is changes. And so that coming together changes as well.
Right, right. How there's also a debate that surrounds how people also looking at our current vantage point, they look at these thinkers, philosophers from the past, and then they are judged based on their morality. Like, for example, certain American presidents, even though they write very beautifully, but they were slave owners. Certain philosophers were believers in racism, like Immanuel Kant. How about you? Like, when you look at such texts, do you evaluate it with that kind of critical lens, and do you still feel like, even though we're very aware of like how in that era that they grew up in or that they were based in, right, there's all these moral sins and all these moral failings, but at the same time, what's more interesting is to study how they come about to come up with their own philosophical thoughts or about their thoughts on society and human nature. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the figure that really interests me in this regard is Heidegger. So Martin Heidegger was a German philosopher in the 20th century, and second only to Wittgenstein, the philosopher I've done the most sort of academic work on. And he was also a member of the Nazi Party for a period. And what do you do with that? This is actually something, if I can sort of do a sort of a self pitch. This is something I've written on my blog a couple months ago. I have these sort of newsletters that I send out, and I can't remember, it's like October or November. I have this thing about what do you do about Heidegger. But I actually think the Heidegger case is a really interesting one, right? That, with some forms of this, you can say, oh, well, that was the way things were at that time, Kant was racist, but, blah, 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 blah. But like, first of all, not everybody was a Nazi in the 1930s, not even every German. And second of all, Heidegger's, so actually, one comparison that I like to draw is with Gottlob Frege, who was a sort of the greatest philosopher most people haven't heard of. He was sort of the founding figure in analytic philosophy. He was a mathematician and a logician, and did foundational work in philosophy of language in particular, as well as the philosophy of mathematics. He died in 1924. He was also, a virulent nationalist and anti-Semite, like the kind of person who, had he lived a little longer, would definitely have been a Nazi. But also, like, Frege is not as troubling in the sense that, you can say, okay, horrible person, but wow, did he do some great work in logic? And it's not like he was doing Nazi logic, he was just doing logic. Whereas with Heidegger, like, Heidegger is trying to tell you how to live. He doesn't put it in those terms, but it's hard to come away from Heidegger without feeling this strong moral and spiritual demand that's being placed on you by that writing. And, as somebody who clearly has taken some time with Heidegger, I think there's something valuable there. So what do I do with the fact that he was a Nazi? Obviously, I don't think that his writing entails that, if you accept this, you must become a Nazi, because I haven't gone that route. But I also feel like it's a problem that we should be troubled by. Like, there's the root of canceling Heidegger, of saying, like, well, he was a Nazi, let's just throw it all out. We don't need him. There's other good philosophers there. But then we also don't learn from him. And I mean that both in the sense that we don't learn from him in the sense that he wrote some really important philosophy, but also we don't learn from the fact that he was a Nazi. We sort of choose not to learn from that. The other version of that is to sort of, try to downplay it, to say, well, he made some bad choices, but, we can sort of push that aside and really focus on the work. But part of what I find really interesting about Heidegger is, while, I don't think that there's anything in his writing that sort of entails Nazism, there is, for instance, a kind of an unmistakable conservative streak, that when you read that writing, it's not hard to see why somebody who is in a political environment where, your choices are basically fascism or communism went for the fascists. I guess fascist is a bit of an anachronistic term, Nazi. And I think that the thing that's really valuable there is to recognize, first of all, these two things can sit together. And I think one of the lessons you can learn there is that philosophy doesn't give you all the answers, right? That, you know, you can be a great philosopher and a total shit. And you can also be a really lovely person with really bad philosophy. Um, and I think that, you know, there can be a temptation among philosophers to sort of think that somehow, you know, if I can just get myself philosophically in order, everything else will take care of itself. And I think Heidegger's a really good teaching moment for that, of like, no, you know, you can really get the philosophy together, and that isn't going to save you from being a bad person. So I think there's something really valuable to learn there. And also I just think I continue to think about Heidegger because I'm troubled by Heidegger. You know, if I felt like, you know, that's all clear, I wouldn't continue to think about him. So in a sense, he's sort of done me a favor by being a really problematic person. So I think there's a lot to be learned there, even if there's a lot there that I want to reject. And precisely there's a lot to be learned there because there's so much I want to work with as well as reject. And working with that tension, I think, can be really interesting.
Yeah, it's funny actually. Now that you brought this up, it almost is a counter argument to perhaps your essay about how you know, in an age of Trump, why we need more philosophy students. I mean, it doesn't seem to absolve philosophy doesn't seem to absolve people to have fascistic tendencies. I mean, I think that's also like one of the fascinating things about human nature, which is how, despite how intelligent and how yeah, how smart you think you can be, but somehow there's something within human nature that does not per se protect you from becoming a really you know, from opting to do something oppressive or unjust as well. And I think it speaks to other conditions in the human world that can compare us in that fashion. Santosh, I was just wondering, do you have a question, especially given you are much more vociferous reader than I am?
No, you know, this beautiful symbol of the Tao, the Dao, it just came to my mind. So in the Dao, you have the black and the white. Within the black, there is a spot of a white, and within the white, there is a tinge and a spot of the black. And that's the beauty of the harmony of opposites. And yeah, it just goes to show that the lesson to glean from this is humility, that we all have our blind spots, irrespective of our genius and our thoughtfulness and our abilities. And this requires us to collaborate with one another and to humbly ask others to check in on us and to let us know if there are blind spots that we have ourselves. So it's actually a critical enabler for community. Yeah, the fact that, you know, I have my blind spots and I'm not perfect, but I've got some strengths that I can add to a community, and someone else can alert me to my blind spots because I'm blind in a certain way, in the way which I look at the world. So it requires a certain humbling and a certain convening of a community in a state of vulnerability where we acknowledge our fallibility, our individual and our collective fallibility, and suspend our collective judgments, our individual and collective judgments, to move forward as a human civilization. Yeah, so I think that's a very beautiful takeaway from me after hearing all of this. And nature is a beautiful example and metaphor for community and ecosystems. Like, you know, I mean, when I look at, let's say, the National Geographic, when I see a lion coming and a lion mercilessly eating a deer, for example, or the prey, like that is quite savage, it's quite barbaric. But in the grander scheme of things, like in the ecosystem of nature, like, yeah, there's this interconnectedness and this harmony that's playing out in nature, that only through humility and the suspension of our individual judgments and with people around us, with the support of community around us, we'll be able to see wider and further as a race or a human civilization. Yeah, so that's what came to my mind.
So it's funny, Santosh, now that you said all that, I was just thinking, back to you, David, about the question of Heidegger and how there was his student, Hannah Arendt, right? Who was his lover, but his collaborator, and clearly a Jew. But just thinking back to what Santosh said, it's like she could have been that countervailing force, but even she was, from what I understand in what we know from the history, she was also not able to sway Heidegger away from his conversion to Nazism. Yeah.
I think one of the problems with being really smart is, as in clever, is it can make you very stubborn. That if you're really clever, it means that if you've committed yourself to a particular point of view, it's very easy to kind of argue around people who try to talk you out of it. And I mean, this maybe touches back on Santosh's point about humility, that when we talk about great philosophers or what makes a great philosopher, there are sort of these, this capacity for rational or logical thinking, this sort of penetrating insight. There are certain qualities that we associate with great philosophy. But I think there are certain virtues of character that I think are also really important. I think humility is one of them, and not just in the sense that having the humility to realize you shouldn't be a Nazi, but on a simpler level of just could I be wrong? If that question isn't always on your mind, you're going to make mistakes. Curiosity is another one. Actually, a friend of mine, Gabriel Citron, has written a really lovely paper about philosophical virtues, but in particular, like relating philosophical virtues to virtues of character. And how much of one way you could say it is that Heidegger had some philosophical virtues in spades, and others he was deeply deficient in, and in particular, his political and personal failings were also philosophical failings that were connected to this sort of vices of character that were also philosophical vices.
All right. So just going back into the start of our conversation, which was about your course. So you have 10 different topics in your online course, and we can't obviously go through all of it, but I just like to focus on one of it, since it does seem at least pertinent to what we're talking about right now. So moralism and amoralism, and you'll be working off the authors Leo Tolstoy and Oscar Wilde. So can you kind of like briefly describe what these two authors have to offer on that topic? And as a kind of run-on question, right? Do you think, as it stands where we are right now, do you think we spend enough time, too much time, too little time having discussions about morality?
Ooh, yeah, that second question, I don't know how I'm going to answer that one. We'll see how I get there. So one of the themes that runs throughout the course is basically this question of like, what is literature good for? Or to put it another way, does literature make us good or help us be good? That we have there's a strong tendency, people say like books are good for you, reading is good for you, you should read more. And that often comes with a sort of vague notion that somehow I will become a better person by reading all these sensitive things and stuff. While there's a sort of a vague sense in which that seems right, if you try to spell it out precisely, it can be very hard to spell it out in a way that makes it sound plausible. And so this is a topic that we engage with a lot. And in particular, I mean, that's especially a theme for the second half of the course. I mean, the way I've set up the course is we have the first half, the first 5 of 10 weeks are set in ancient Greece with Sophocles and Plato and Aristotle, and then the second half moves into the modern world. So the Wilde and Tolstoy session is the first of that second group of 5. So it's sort of kind of, you might say, like an appetizer. I'm going to turn off my pinging, which I should have done before we started this conversation. So neither Wilde nor Tolstoy are philosophers. And actually, it's interesting how few great philosophers are also great authors of great literary artists. I mean, there are sort of great philosophers who are great writers. I mean, Plato, Nietzsche, Zhuangzi. I mean, there's a number of people who just wrote beautifully as philosophers. And there are, philosophical writers of high esteem, like somebody like Dostoevsky comes to mind. Very few people did philosophy and also did writing. I mean, Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre and Iris Murdoch are 2 obvious examples. Rabindranath Tagore is maybe another instance of this. Wilde and Tolstoy were both great writers. Neither of them were philosophers, even though, and actually Tolstoy is an interesting case because, the book will look at, we're looking at excerpts from his work, What is Art, which, might say is an attempt to do philosophy, but frankly, I don't think it's very good, which raises the question of why did I put it in the course? Partly because I think Tolstoy is a great writer. I mean, you know, if Tolstoy says something, it's worth paying attention to, and I think it's particularly worth paying attention to when great thinkers say things that are a bit silly. But also, I wanted to contrast Wilde and Tolstoy because they were roughly contemporaneous. What is art? I can't remember the exact date, but it's around 1890, and you know, Wilde was also active in the late 19th century. And they're a nice contrasting pair. It's like they kind of set up two poles of, you know, between which, you know, trying to figure out where you want to stand is complicated, but it's almost like we're setting out the goalposts. So on one hand, you have Tolstoy taking this very strong moralistic position. And then there's a whole story behind this that, you know, Tolstoy wrote, you know, some of the greatest novels that have ever been written. And around the time that he was finishing Anna Karenina, he had this kind of spiritual crisis and spiritual conversion, where he kind of radically changed his life and started trying to live like a peasant in great simplicity and started writing simpler stories with stronger morals and all of the rest. And this work, What is Art, comes out of that late period where he's trying to say what art should be, and in particular arguing that the purpose of art has nothing to do with pleasure, and that the point of art is to cultivate a kind of spiritual fellow feeling, that art is great to the extent that it creates a sort of feeling of connectedness between people, and it's not great to the extent that it fails at that. And so, and to some extent, you know, you see Tolstoy disavowing his own work. You know, War and Peace is arguably the greatest novel that was ever written, but if it doesn't cultivate fellow feeling between others, it's worthless. I don't think he ever says as much, but, you know, there's, I think, that implication there that I think he was troubled by his own earlier life. And Wilde is, you know, as far as possible on the opposite extreme, you know, that he was associated with this movement of art for art's sake, but has these sort of deliberately flippant remarks about, I can't remember exactly what he says, but something about, you know, a moral impulse in writing is an unpardonable mannerism of style. That, you know, he sort of sets it up as a, you know, to say kind of art is about creating delightful surfaces, and it's not just that he doesn't say you shouldn't be trying to advance the moral, but rather he's saying work that tries to advance the moral, that's just another stylistic quirk, and it's just not a very tasteful one. You know, it's in poor taste to try to be moralistic. So it's as if he's trying to even absorb the moralist argument into this aesthetic argument. So in a way, part of what interests me is that they have these like far extreme views. You know, Tolstoy wants to say like the only purpose of art is to like cultivate goodness, and Wilde is saying the only purpose of art is to create pleasure. And, you know, push on either of these views too hard, it's hard to find people who are going to completely embrace them. But it's as if, you know, for the following 4 weeks, then we have the goalpost set and we can sort of figure out where we stand in between.
Yeah, that's fascinating actually, because I do think this topic still is still percolating in society right now. I mean, even if people are not looking into the works of Leo Tolstoy and Oscar Wilde, I mean, but just, you know, there's so much discussion in film, even video games, in television, about what kind of shows are considered art or artistic. Do they merit, you know, winning the Oscar, stuff like that? And you're right, there is always this universal theme of like, are they great because they push some kind of moral message, where that moral message may instill some kind of public or spiritual goodness, or is it really just because, you know, just based on a hedonistic indicator, it just makes us feel good, or we can recognize art just because we recognize it, we see it, and we know what it is. So what is your take on this then? Because I'm very curious to hear, since you've been teaching this for quite a number of years, like, do you find that your answer about what is art changing the more you teach it, or do you actually have an answer for yourself and you're just curious to be challenged by other people around you?
I mean, the short answer, I mean, two short answers and then a longer answer. So the first short answer is, I think I'm more sympathetic to Wilde than to Tolstoy. The second short answer is, I think any attempt to generalize about the purpose of art is going to fail. You know, that there's so many different ways that art can be of service to us, so many different kinds of rewards, so many different kinds of pleasure, that to sort of say everything is like this is just narrow-minded. And in general, I feel like broad generalizations are the worst form of philosophy. The longer answer, I saw a really great talk. This is maybe a decade ago now. The great stage director, Declan Donnellan. I was a student at Oxford at the time, or maybe I was post-student. But anyway, I was in Oxford at the time. His company, Cheek by Jowl, was doing a production in Oxford, and I got to see it, and I got to see a pre-show talk. And one of the things that stayed with me from that was he was talking about how, speaking of generalizations about art, he said, what great art does is it says, the way you think the world is, well, it's not at all like that. Maybe touches back on your opening question. And what bad art does is it says, the way you think the world is, you're right, it's exactly like that. And while I'm not kind of constitutionally opposed to like moral or political messaging in art, I feel like 9 times out of 10, there's a kind of kitschy preaching to the choir, that there's a danger in so much moral and political messaging in art that people will kind of go to the movie, the theater, pick up the book, and sort of think, the way I thought the world was, it turns out I was right. And I just don't think that does anybody any good. And it's very rare to find people who will actively seek out work that will challenge them, that, might. And actually, I think this, this goes beyond art. It goes to sort of, news and stuff that, my politics are generally kind of left of, whatever else. But, I also subscribe to The Economist magazine, which, is bracing partly because they're really smart. I can't just say, well, those guys. If you want to find a robust defense of classical liberalism, The Economist is a great place to go. And it's good to expose. I'll check out Fox News, which is less rewarding because I feel like there's sort of less thought there. But if you can find like intelligent voices on the right, or if your own inclinations are on the right, find intelligent voices on the left. I think it's good to do that. It's good to seek out views that will challenge you. And I think a lot of what we find in both art and political commentary is too often just kind of sort of self-indoctrination that I don't think is very helpful. I mean, I think it can be helpful to sort of find voices that agree with you, to sort of cultivate and refine and make your own view a bit more sophisticated. But you should be seeking out challenges for yourself because nobody else is going to find them for you.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting point because even within discussions among my friends, the ones who do actually try their best to read Anna Karenina, War and Peace, What Crime and Punishment. So I do get the sense that something that they do something they do find in such works is that the messaging, as you mentioned just now, the political messaging is a lot more subtle. Human affairs are depicted to be a lot more complicated. You don't find this kind of like identity stereotypes that, at least in our current popular discourse that we seem to be very much inundated with, like, oh, this is a conservative, this is a left-winger, this is a, whatever, right? Like, so it does seem that those, this very ancient, well, again, just to be very clear, my words, not that ancient, but this older works, right? Like they come from a time where this kind of labels are not applied so glaringly, I guess, and strikingly. And yeah, where I can tell from what you're saying that a good piece of art is where the lines are blurred, where you cannot see that, oh, this is depicting a stereotype or a caricature of something that we see right now, or it's affirming what I believe. It's actually questioning, it's actually making me rethink about how complicated human nature is, which goes back to Heidegger again, because complicated fellow, so much value to learn from his writings, his teachings, but yet at the same time, very difficult to reconcile with his moral character. So yeah, that's kind of like a good way to kind of see art, I guess, that it has to be something that's quite hard to define and not easy to categorize.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Go on.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, saying like, what is art or what is art for is almost as hard as saying like, what are people for? Where, a lot of different people have done a lot of different things.
Santosh, do you have a question?
Yeah. No, so as you were discussing this, like a thought experiment played out in my mind. In schools, if we graded students based on their ability to embrace opposing points of views and their ability to question their own beliefs and their own judgments about an issue, and then we would probably create better leaders for our society. So because Douglas and I, we were in the civil service, yeah, then we would probably have civil servants who would consider opposing points of views in policy formulation and implementation. We would elect political office holders who would want to embrace opposing political points of views from opposing political parties as well. You know, so if it starts from school and the way we change the way we assess and we grade students, yeah, because right now the current setup in academia and then in the way we do performance appraisal in the private sector, in the public sector, and then in the way we assess our leaders who we elect in our societies is based on how convincing they are on their own views, but not so much about how they're willing to say, I don't know. And hey, you got a good point there. You opposing point of view from an opponent, you have a good point there. And I'm willing to consider that and advance the state and the quality of discourse to reveal a different truth from what I held on to dearly. So that's quite a powerful thought experiment for me.
Yeah, actually, the expression devil's advocate, I think originates with the Jesuits. I could be wrong about it specifically being the Jesuits, but basically it was, you know, a religious order where they would have these theological debates and somebody was assigned to be the devil's advocate, to sort of to speak on behalf of the devil. And the idea was, you know, our theological arguments will be strengthened by encountering this opposition. So, you know, we will appoint you to sort of argue the opposition so that we can strengthen our own views. And I mean, as far as I understand, I mean, there are, you know, various organizations and think tanks and stuff that do deliberately have that structure of, you know, we need somebody here to take up the opposing point of view, even just in a devil's advocate kind of way, so that we can really kind of, you know, check ourselves for mistakes and avoid groupthink and avoid, you know, getting into some kind of epistemic bubble or something like that.
Well, that sounds like a dangerous idea. So moving on from that, so let's talk about your other online course, right? So Introduction to Philosophy in 10 Dangerous Ideas. And as you mentioned, I was thinking at the very least, we try to pick on one of the topics you had, which is on Zhuangzi and his idea of relativizing rights and wrongs. So, I mean, just as a start, as a question for you, David, I mean, first thing, do you see significant differences in terms of how Western and non-Western philosophies tackle morality? And, you know, and follow on from that is about Zhuangzi and what exactly does he have to say about the relativity of wrong and rights?
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I mean, so again, you very graciously shared some of these questions ahead of time. So, you know, I knew you were going to ask about this sort of Western, non-Western, and you know, I don't know. I mean, I feel I could make some like big generalizations, but I kind of almost want to go back to that point that the, you know, differences are often more interesting than similarities. So, I mean, just, you know, one example I was thinking about was, you know, if you were to like kind of blank out the names of the authors and just present somebody with something by Aristotle, something by Xunzi, and something by Lao Tzu, and say, you know, which two of these three come from the same tradition? Probably the person would say, oh, well, Aristotle and Xunzi, you know, that they both have this sort of very essayistic style where they argue sort of point by point in a very rational way, and then, you know, Lao Tzu is sort of writing poetry. And, you know, I think that, you know, that sort of illustrates how, you know, any attempt to sort of say like, well, you know, classical Chinese philosophy is like this, classical Greek philosophy is like this, is probably going to brush over the fact that, you know, within these traditions, there's greater diversity than, you know, there is sort of difference between them. And that's maybe particularly germane if we're going to talk about Zhuangzi, because, you know, he's a weirdo by anybody's standards, right? Like, this isn't like, you know, an exemplar of how philosophy was done in the Warring States period in China. That, you know, part of what I find bracing and really exciting about Zhuangzi is there's nothing else like him. Certainly not in the ancient world, and I don't think really since. And it's the kind of thing where, you know, to you know, those who aren't familiar with Zhuangzi, I mean, you kind of got to read him to get the flavor of it. But is this sort of bizarre mix of, strange parables, short stories, jokes. That there's this sort of very lively wit and sense of humor, and at every stage, not just sort of undermining conventional wisdom, but undermining of the conventional wisdom. Zhuangzi is generally associated with the Taoist school, although, as far as we know, you have Lao Tzu with the Tao Te Ching, and then it's not clear that Zhuangzi was in any way familiar with it or influenced by it. Perhaps not, but it's much later in the Chinese tradition that there's sort of this label Taoism that then gets sort of stamped on these two ancient texts. One characteristic of, one thing that they have in common, maybe that makes it not crazy to say they're both Taoist, is this kind of mystical notion of, kind of going along with the flow of things, not trying to resist, seeing everything as kind of interconnected, seeing everything as one. And there's this one moment, I think, that's quite revealing in the second chapter of the Zhuangzi, which is the chapter that I've sort of assigned in this course, where he says, and I can't remember exactly how he puts it, but this sort of poetic, lyrical passage where he says, heaven and the 100 things are one. And then he pauses and says, what do I mean when I say everything is one? If I say it, then there's the one, and then there's the me saying it, and that makes two. And as soon as I say that, I've got the saying it, the one, and the thing that I just remarked on, that makes three. And suddenly we have this, proliferation. And it's as if, he can't say any one thing without immediately undoing it. And there's something acrobatic about the way that he writes in that sense, and it can often be tremendously funny. But one of the things he gets at, certainly in that second chapter called On Equalizing Things, I want to say it's Qiulun in Chinese, but I don't actually know Chinese, so I'd be making it up, he's in a way engaging with a lot of the contemporary debates of the time. So two of the major philosophical schools, this is sort of in the Warring States period, sort of in the late Zhou dynasty, were the Confucian school and the Maoist school, and they disagreed about a lot of things. In particular, the Confucians were famous for this sort of notion of filial piety or family reverence, this idea of showing a particular concern that's sort of modeled on the concern for the family unit. And one of the things that was radical about the Moists was this idea of impartial caring, that everybody counts equally. This is sort of, you can see a version of this in contemporary utilitarianism, that you're making some kind of mistake if you favor those close to you over those who are distant from you. So in a sense, you could see that like Confucians and Moists would have this debate about, is it right to care more about your father than a stranger? Yes, no, right, wrong, and that sort of thing. And one of the things that Zhuangzi does is he sort of steps in and says, what would settle it? How would we even determine, what's right and what's wrong here? Supposing some impartial judge came along and said, okay, the Confucians are right and the Moists are wrong. How do we know that the judge is right? Do we need like another judge to determine whether that judge made the right judgment? And if so, do we? And he sort of, one of the things he likes to do is sort of try to undermine the very idea that this kind of systematic argumentation is going to get you where you need to get to. And I mean, there's a lot of scholarship on the Zhuangzi and like what exactly we should draw from that. But one of the lessons it seems like he's trying to push on is sort of, stop fussing about all of these things that you claim are really important, because they're not actually the thing that is most important. And, and as soon as you think you've grasped the thing that's important, you're going to realize that the thing you've grasped isn't actually the thing that you took to be important. That's a very long-winded answer. I kind of almost want to like supplement it with an account of why this counts as like a dangerous idea.
Yeah, no, actually, I was going to ask that. Yeah, so please go ahead. Like what, in fact, in formulating and crafting this course, right? What was the criteria? What were the questions you had in mind to consider something dangerous as a dangerous idea?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, because I think this also ties into the previous issue about, seeking out works that will kind of really confirm my sense that I was right all along. One of the challenges I've faced when teaching philosophy, especially to like an intro level philosophy class or people encountering philosophy for the first time, is that there can be a strong tendency to think, you know, so-and-so says a thing that I already agree with, therefore so-and-so is right. Or so-and-so says this thing that I don't like, therefore so-and-so is wrong. And I think partly this is a defensive measure, right? That like, it's really hard to do philosophy, and it can be, you know, kind of lets you off the hook to sort of just say, well, I don't need to engage with this stuff because clearly so-and-so is right and so-and-so else is wrong. But also encountering this again and again has made me think, you know, how can I sort of short circuit that response? And so the thought behind this course is to present people with arguments that in some way ought to unsettle them, you know, in some way ought to make people think that can't be right, or I don't want that to be right, or there's something weird going on, or accepting this places a tremendous demand on me in some way. So that we'll kind of maybe start from a position of resistance, but, you know, all of the texts I've chosen are very good, which means that if you want to resist them, you can't just say, well, obviously that's wrong because it doesn't agree with me. You have to really engage with them. And I'm hoping that, you know, in each case, there will be this really productive engagement of sort of hitting up against something that surprises you, sort of provides some kind of a shock that then, you know, we in our discussion have to work through. That, you know, once you've encountered this idea, you don't have the luxury of never having read it before. And that means you've got work to do, whatever kind of work that is. So, I mean, with Zhuangzi at least, I mean, yeah, and you know, some of these, like, part of it was also, I mean, there were a number of criteria why I chose the text I chose. And, you know, I don't think Zhuangzi is confrontational in quite that way, but I think there is something very unsettling that, you know, if you were to really take Zhuangzi seriously, you know, we all have opinions, we all have views, and all of them are subject to the kind of critique that he makes. And if we want to take him seriously, it kind of pulls out from under us the, you know, the ground that we're standing on in some, you know, potentially really illuminating ways.
Yeah, I think you know, like not well, in a previous episode, I had invited a philosopher, Ian James Kidd, and he was someone who was using also Western text, Asian text as well, to talk about misanthropy. And you know, he was, at least in my view, you know, what I took away from the session was really this really earth-shattering, like just you know, breaking conventions about these thinkers, that these people were not, they had misanthropic views, and they had a certain kind of teaching to teach us about the human condition, and about moral vices and failings. And I took a lot from that because it definitely forced me to reevaluate even my outlook. And I think that's what you mean about the idea about a dangerous idea, which is it really has to kind of shake you to your moral core, I guess, and your comfort with what you know about the world. And as you said just now, you have to do some kind of work, intellectual, psychological, emotional work, to kind of like reconcile something that's very contradictory or very controversial, but yet seems so true. And because it's backed by the soundness of the arguments and maybe even the empirical reality of it. Santosh, you were going to jump in?
No, I think it's the futility of engaging in the world of forms, and this is what the practice of meditation is really all about. Because the moment we grapple and we hold on to a form, there's always an opposite to which we will not be able to reconcile. And so it's a lot about dissolution of the world of forms and going back into the world of the formless. And that's why Zhuangzi always says, what's the fuss? Don't fuss around it. Don't fuss around with the world of forms. And this is also in verse 2 of the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Yeah, like any arguments like between like right and wrong and good and bad, yeah, it's they're interdependent. The existence of one requires the existence of the others. The polarities naturally emerge in the world of forms. Yeah, and that's why, like, going back to the source of the formless from which we all come from, I think that's beautiful. I mean, that's what I took away.
David, let me just, from that, from what Santosh shared, right, would you say that this is then a kind of anti-Platonist kind of philosophy, where we're not trying to look for some kind of ideal form, but we're just trying to work with what we got? And doesn't that kind of relate to also Wittgenstein's concept of language games?
Wow, that's yeah, cool. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I should say one of the things I find really bracing about Zhuangzi is, I gave that example of him saying, well, everything is one, and then saying, wait a minute. I almost feel like he might say the same thing about this talk about the formless, that one of the things I think is really interesting about Zhuangzi, and I think, as you know, something he has in common with Wittgenstein is how acutely sensitive he is to the way that the language we use informs our thought. And one feature that I think is really interesting. I mean, so actually, I'll maybe like just quickly side thing. I mean, there's a lovely passage later in the Zhuangzi, and I'm not going to quote this exactly, but he says like we have the snare to catch the rabbit. I think when we've caught the rabbit, we can throw away the snare. We don't need it anymore. And when we have the net to catch the fish, when we've caught the fish, we can throw away the net. We don't need it anymore. We have meaning or language in order to capture the Tao, the way, and when we got it, we don't need words anymore. I want to find the man who's got beyond words. I'd like to have a word with him. And it's sort of, I think, really, again, this is a very gentle humor, but the way that it sort of captures, on one hand, any attempt to say the thing is going to misfire. But also, all we've got is words in some way. Like, there isn't a philosophy of silence in quite that sense. And one of the things that I think is really interesting, I mean, to sort of try to connect this to your question about Wittgenstein, one of the things I think Zhuangzi and Wittgenstein do really elegantly, certainly in Wittgenstein's later philosophy, is sort of pick apart the problems that philosophy creates with language from within, rather than sort of making some big pronouncement and saying, therefore, blah, blah, blah. Sort of starting kind of in the midst of things and kind of encountering these various, dead ends or aporias or confusions and sort of picking them apart, but sort of, as if both of them want to say there is no starting point. There is no sort of secure ground that you can base your philosophy on. You just have to kind of start in the thick of things, start in the midst of confusion. And there's no end point where you're free from confusion. At best, you can kind of get these temporary respites, but the confusion is always there. You always have to be on your guard, and you always have to be nimble. And one of the things I think Wittgenstein's humor is less obvious. Although, if I can do another self-plug, I have written an article about kind of humor in Wittgenstein as well. But I think both of them use humor. I think it's not a coincidence in the sense that both of them kind of want to recognize this sort of moment of paradox, the way that there is no point at which you're going to like get to the answer. At best, you're going to sort of think you got to the answer and then realize that wasn't the answer anyway. But that's the best we can do, we language-using, embodied, earthy creatures.
Yeah, one of the terms that I noticed you like to use in your writings is self-bafflement, right? So I think that's like a key word to kind of describe that kind of confusion, the kind of what do you want to call it, cognitive dissonance that perhaps we just perpetually live in, that we always have to kind of wrestle with when it comes to meanings of words and as to what we're looking for instead of certain ideals and certain values. So I would definitely want to go into that later, but just before I go into that, since we're really getting close to talk about Wittgenstein and Heidegger, but I just had this one question, right, which is about two of the most recent texts you have in your course, which is The Right to Sex and The Case for Rage. And again, these two are considered very dangerous philosophical ideas. Can you tell us, just for the viewers or so, kind of like an introduction as to why you picked these two texts and why they are so contrarian to whether it's mainstream philosophy or conventional wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I mean, so like in a way, it's and this is why I sort of said earlier, like the criteria were mixed, right? Like there's a certain sense in which both of them are very much of their time, but both of them, I think, confront us with issues that should make people uncomfortable. So in the case of Myisha Cherry's Case for Rage, I mean, I think there's sort of a straightforward version of that, and that's right there in the title, which is that, most people think we shouldn't get angry, like I was certainly raised to not get angry. And as Cherry notes, I mean, there's a very long philosophical tradition, like in the Buddhist tradition, anger is, one of the poisons. The Stoics were very much opposed to anger. A more recent target is, Martha Nussbaum has written extensively about how anger is not productive. And basically, and Cherry's, not just saying like, yeah, we should get angry all the time. She has a very, sophisticated argument where she sort of, teases apart different forms of anger, but at least thinks that there's a certain kind of anger that is appropriate as a response to certain kinds of injustice. That is not a matter of saying, first of all, that you should say like that anger is inappropriate, but also that anger is actually productive. It's not just like, oh, it's justifiable or it's understandable, but actually it is right to be angry in these cases. And in that sense, she is pushing against, a very long grain in the history of philosophy. And I think, not coincidentally, the history of philosophy is written predominantly by men, predominantly in the West by white men, predominantly by people who are in the sorts of positions of privilege that mean that they're in a position to write books of philosophy in the first place. And Myisha Cherry, as an African-American woman, is able to see this from a different perspective. She's able to sort of look at this tradition of saying, don't get angry, as, part of a tradition of saying, like, don't rock the boat. And not rocking the boat is great if you're kind of sitting at the top of the boat. But if you're, I don't know what the appropriate metaphor is, if you're drowning in sea, maybe rocking the boat is the thing you need to do. So yeah, I think there's something really interesting there that, if nothing else, there should be a conversation to be had about anger. I don't think I entirely agree with Cherry, but that's one of the reasons I wanted to engage more with her work. I also recognize that maybe one of the reasons I don't feel naturally inclined to agree with Cherry is that I'm a white middle-class man in a position of privilege who doesn't, has been raised to think that not rocking the boat will work out well for me. So yeah, I think, there's something like in the political winds that mean that, this idea that, getting angry is good isn't like a crazy thought. But I think there's no safe ground there. Whatever you think about anger is something that can be challenged. I think Cherry is good for getting a conversation started there. Amia Srinivisan's essay, so this was first an essay in the London Review of Books. And it goes in a lot of different places. It does a lot of different things. It's an essay rather than like a sort of a philosophical argument. One of the themes, and this is something that really hit me when I first read it, is it sort of tries to confront us, among other things, it tries to confront us with sort of the political structures that shape our desire. One response to desire is to say, like, we want what we want, we love what we love. And there are sort of, there are very good versions of this, right? That, being in favor of gay, queer, trans rights is in a way one thing people will say is like, people desire what they desire. Like when I was young, this mercifully seems to have changed a lot just in my lifetime, but it used to be this thought that there's something psychologically wrong with you if you're attracted to people of the same gender, and we need to change that. And I think there's been a lot of good that's been done in saying, like, no, actually, people want what they want, don't try to change that. But there's, obviously darker sides to this as well, that, what we happen to want sexually, what we happen to find sexually desirable is very much conditioned by our political circumstances. And one of the things that's, I think, unsettling about that is that, I think there's a natural way of thinking about, my sexual desires, my sexuality as sort of the most inmost private personal part of me. And to say, like, no, actually that's, look at the kind of people you look at. There's something political there. There are patterns to what you desire, and those patterns have been and there's sort of obvious ways that like heterosexual men have been conditioned to like skinny young women, that kind of thing. But I think it gets a lot more sophisticated and subtle than that. If that was all that Srinivisan was saying, I could be like, yeah, I knew that. But I think it really had an impact on me in this regard of just sort of making me think, like, what are these patterns and what are the politics behind them? And also, what is my responsibility toward those politics? I can't, in the same way that, one ought not to be forced to change one's sexual orientation. Like, there are certain limits to how, the kind of violence that would be done upon myself if I were to try to change my desires. But that's also not a reason for complacency. And I think one of the values of it being an essay is that Srinivisan doesn't give you an answer. She doesn't sort of say, here's what you ought to do. But rather, she leaves you with this problem that she has done a really elegant job of presenting of, so what are you going to do about your desires? And what can you do and what should you do? And that's just one part of it. She deals with the whole phenomenon of incels, of misogynistic violence. There's a lot going on in the essay. And this is, since been published in this book, The Right to Sex, which is sort of a series of essays that, really I think in some really interesting and profound ways, plumb the depths of the way in which gender and sexuality and politics and these various other things, intersect in the present day.
Yeah, so I read this book quite some time ago, and I was just trying to reread it a little bit just before we start. And there were like a few things that I wanted to point out to just sort of make the book like really relatable and relevant for people who are listening. So, for example, she talks about how, and since, for example, I'm a Chinese guy, so she talks about how like there's this Korean, American Korean model. So she was like in a beauty pageant, and she was supposed to be there to break down the barrier of Asian models, but she said that but I don't want to date a Korean guy. I was just going to Asian guys. And then there's even another passage where Amia talks about ever since the essay came out, she received an email from, I believe, a Bangladeshi or Indian person in Australia, and who said that he's straight, but when he goes to date women, he knows that he's being devalued as compared to a white guy. And even among gay platforms as well, there was an experiment where they had a white guy and an Asian guy, and they swapped profiles. So meaning that the Asian guy pretended to be white and the white guy pretended to be Asian, and you could see like they got very different responses on this gay dating platform. So these are like some of the very contemporary issues I think people do talk about, and it's great to have a philosopher actually tackle this with so much thought and consideration. And you're right, I don't think she comes with a real answer, because I think it's quite irresolvable. It's just really something for us to reflect and to mediate on, to meditate on, as to how our desires are really shaped by social forces that we're not questioning hard enough. And also for Myisha's Cherries, the case for rage. So on our podcast, on our channel, we have done an episode on anger, which was quite some time ago, maybe a couple of months back. And Myisha Cherry's book wasn't out yet, but I kind of took whatever material that I could find on the internet and tried to juxtapose that with Martha Nussbaum's case for, against anger. And I think the main issue for me, the main takeaway I feel viewers should have is just that we need to have a richer vocabulary about such terms. Just like how I don't like the way the Stoics kind of box and cage anger as a kind of vice. Like, I just feel it's very simplistic. So I think, like a better philosophy is one that looks at these terms with a lot more depth. And also, like, in the sense that the way that's lived out in the world, because anger is not always unequivocally bad in every scenario, in every case. And there's even situations where a disadvantaged group may have to utilize something that's conventionally defined as a vice, but to go to empower themselves, or to put forth some kind of agenda.
Yeah, arguably, right? And part of what's on the flip side, I'm just sort of thinking about this, a couple of days after the death of Desmond Tutu, gestures of love from people who have every reason to be angry are tremendously powerful. This is not a refutation of Cherry's argument in a sentence or anything like that, but just to say, I think there's a very rich discussion to be had there. I think there's something really interesting to be discussed on the topic of anger, and one of the reasons I put it in the course is I look forward to getting into it more.
Right. So let's get into Wittgenstein and Heidegger. So like we have already been talking quite a bit about them. And I just thought maybe as a kind of kickstart off our discussion about the two of them. So you've written, like I said, the authenticity of ordinary experience. So take us through a little bit, like a 101, right, as to some of the concepts that have been useful coming from this both thinkers. I'm thinking in the case of like from Heidegger, Dasein, which is, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, being in the world, and how that's not Dasein, right? Sorry. So like how that is not exactly about existence. It's something more than that, right? And with Wittgenstein, attunement. That's as far as I got, as coming to understand both this very notoriously difficult philosophers. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm wondering where I should be starting. Do you want me to just sort of say a bit about this idea of Dasein and being in the world, or
Well,
where
why not relate to the idea of authenticity? Since it's something that you've obviously written about. Yeah, I'm interested again in the discussion about how do we exactly define and how do we exactly identify authenticity, and how does that relate to ordinary experience?
Yeah, ooh, yeah, I probably should have thought how to do this in sort of brief, accessible form. I mean, authenticity is a really interesting idea in the sense that it seems to be, I mean, one way of framing it is to say it's a very distinctively modern phenomenon, you know, that the discourse on authenticity seems to kind of arise sometime in the 19th century. And, you know, you have somebody like Kierkegaard, who is also sort of credited with being like a sort of proto-existentialist figure, talking a lot about it. But, you know, on one hand, people will often talk about this interest in authenticity arising, historically speaking, at a time when there's sort of a growing alienation of self from society, the sense that somehow like being a part of a communal whole is somehow something that people don't feel comfortable with, and we need to sort of find our own way toward it. That said, I mean, I taught a course on existentialism a couple of years ago where, you know, three of the starting no, I don't think I used Plato's Apology, but I could have done. Maybe I did. But, you know, figures like Socrates, I definitely used the Bible, you know, the figure of Christ and St. Augustine's Confessions, that, you know, you can go way back and find figures who are in different ways saying, you know, wake up, stop doing things just because that's how they're done, and kind of see for yourself, do for yourself. I mean, in its basic core, this idea of authenticity is basically some version of that. You know, the idea that there's something bad, you know, broadly speaking, about being or behaving in a certain way that is conventional, of sort of not thinking for yourself, a lot, basically allowing others, or allowing kind of social forces at large to make your decisions for you. And one of the dangers there is not that, you know, I will be faced with this decision and think to myself, what do the cool people do? I will do that. But rather, I won't even notice that I'm making a decision, that I'll sort of almost kind of automatically go along, you know, like in everything from my like clothing purchases to, you know, my decisions about who to marry, or whether to marry. Kind of doing it because that's how it's done. That's how one does things. You know, in Heidegger, one of the terms that he brings in when he starts talking about authenticity is das Man in German, which is one of those terms that's very hard to translate. Literally means the one, but not the one in the sense of like I am the one, but rather the one in the sense of, you know, what one does. You know, that he thinks that there's a sort of a tendency, a kind of a gravitational pull to do things the way that one does them. You know, this is, and he also will say this isn't bad necessarily, right? You know, that there is a way that, you know, one puts on one's trousers one leg at a time. And, you know, I'm not, you know, some kind of sheep going along with the crowd if that's what I do. But there can be this sort of leveling tendency that, you know, we live in a socially structured world in all sorts of ways that do require that there be certain norms that we accord ourselves with, but then they can go from, you know, like, well, everyone else here is driving on the right side of the road, so I will too, to, you know, everybody else is joining this fascist rally, so I will too, which doesn't seem to trouble Heidegger too much. You know, in a way, one of the, I mean, you know, there's a whole like story that Heidegger tells behind all this that I think is really interesting, that I haven't really gotten into, that connects to the idea of Dasein as being in the world and all this. I'm just trying to think if there's a really quick way I could bring that in. I mean, one simple way of putting it is to say that, you know, he wants to sketch this picture of human existence as sort of, as he puts it, always already engaged with the world. That there's a way of thinking about the world as, you know, there's this world, which is this empty container, and then it's like furnished with a bunch of objects. There's a chair, there's a table, there's a human being, and these are sort of things that happen to have been put into the world. And Heidegger wants to say, no, actually, being Dasein, being a person, and there being a world are essentially coupled. That in a sense, the world that I'm in has the significance that it has by virtue of me making sense of my existence in it. So like one really simple example is, I'm staring at a computer screen and I'm talking to you two. And why am I doing this? I guess you invited me. That was very nice. And I like talking about philosophy, and I thought that would be a good idea. And, I could sort of build this whole story that sort of builds toward a sort of idea of who I am and what it is appropriate to do and how to be in the world. It wasn't like at the forefront of my mind, but somehow was in the background informing it. And one of the really interesting moments in Heidegger is this discussion of anxiety, where he says, like, for the most part, we kind of have this sort of bigger picture sense of everything making sense. But there can be these moments where everything stops making sense. And, if this conversation and this laptop makes sense to me because they're part of this story I have about being a philosopher and all the rest, if that big picture suddenly makes no sense to me, then suddenly I'll be confronted with, what am I doing here? Who am I talking to? What is this thing in front of me? One thing I like to liken this to is that game where if you repeat a word enough times, it stops making sense. If I say pencil, I know what a pencil is. It's that thing you write with. But if I say pencil, 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 it eventually starts to sound like this bizarre sound that has no connection to the thing. And Heidegger wants to say that there can be these brief moments where that happens with kind of your life as a whole, that sort of the world just stops making sense to you. And for him, that's really valuable, because that then suddenly makes you recognize that the fact that things made sense in the first place isn't just because, everything has a meaning and a significance, but rather it had that significance because I was invested in it in a certain way, and I was living out a certain story of my life that gave it the significance that it had. And that then also means that I am in some sense responsible for it making sense. Like this laptop doesn't have a meaning that is independent of me. It has the meaning it has because it has a place in my life. And that means that I am in some sense always responsible for kind of renewing my kind of investment in the way that I make sense of things. So, the Heideggerian story about authenticity is one about, be mindful of, be ready for this anxiety, be mindful of the way that you are responsible at every moment for kind of making sense of the meaning of your life. All of this is less obvious in Wittgenstein. So this book that I wrote, one of the main arguments was basically this sort of story, something like this story is going on in Wittgenstein as well. And one reason why that is worth saying is, one of the things that's really interesting about Wittgenstein is, on one hand, like, there's something really bracing about reading him. People seem to be transformed by him. He inspires people to write, to create artwork. Some of them are terrible, some of them are great. And he really seems to confront people with a sense of, once I've read Wittgenstein, I have to change my life. But if you read Wittgenstein, most of what he says is about logic and language. And it's unclear how somebody making some arguments about the nature of logic and language can have that effect. And so one of the things I was trying to do is kind of pick that out to sort of see how, at least in my view, a lot of what Wittgenstein, especially in his later philosophy, is trying to do is to get us in a way that's not dissimilar to Heidegger. I think that, again, sort of like, Chinese philosophy versus Western philosophy, I think like the differences are more interesting often than the similarities, but sometimes you need to see the similarity before you can talk about the differences. So the similarity that I think is there is that, with Wittgenstein too, there's a sense that something as simple as the meaning of a word is something that we think that words have independent of us, but somehow we are responsible in our practices for imbuing our lives with meaning and our words with meaning and what we do with meaning. And there's a sort of similar sort of story going on in Wittgenstein as there is in Heidegger. That was a very long answer to a very short question. I apologize.
No, but that's great. I think it covers a lot of ground, so I can try to dive into some specifics as to the best of my ability as well, because given my understanding of this, two philosophers are quite rudimentary. But I like one of the poems that you had. So it's from Seamus Henley's Elegy. So the way we're living, timorous or bold, will have been our life. And I think you kind of quoted that to kind of give a succinct definition of Dasein, which is that it's open and it's open to change. And I'm quoting you here that the point is not that we can interpret our own experiences, but we cannot not interpret our own being. And so I like that quote, and I think it also goes a lot into saying about how we live our lives, as you mentioned just now, just not even trying to do anything too grand, like just the computer that we're using, the way we're communicating, the projects that we're pursuing, the work that we do. I mean, all of these activities that all this, even just putting on your shoes, wearing your clothes, all these day-to-day activities, ordinary experiences. I mean, there's a certain kind of implicit answer to the question of our understanding of what we do and what we mean and our own being. And one example I was actually thinking of when reading your work, right, was you were talking about pencils, shoes, and all that, and how we have some kind of agreed shared agreement about what these objects are, and at the same time, that kind of bafflement that comes about is when we disagree on the meanings and how we use these objects. And I was thinking of like because you brought it up in your essay about the one about existential anxiety and how you want to sort of induce the feeling of vertigo and anxiety deliberately. And I was thinking of like how I've taken a few basic lessons in parkour. So when to parkour practitioners, right, when you look at a bench or a railing or a tree, it's not just an object to just sit on or to just admire. I mean, these are objects where they climb on, they balance on, they perform, all kinds of activities on it. And to a layperson, that's not that shared understanding of what these objects are meant to be. So you don't go around standing on a bench or trying to somersault around it, stuff like that. But that's what parkour people do. So it's like their meaning, their relationship to such objects are very different compared to lay people. And I think that even taking such a simple example like that, I think that's why we have a lot of conflict around all sorts of incidents, events around the world, right? Because that shared meaning is just not the same sometimes. So yeah, that's kind of like where I'm kind of free associating with what I've come to learn from reading your work.
Yeah, actually, I really like the parkour example, but I think it's interesting. There's I think an interesting difference between, say, that and a political disagreement. A certain amount of disagreement is built into politics. That the reason there is politics at all is that we don't always all agree, and different societies have set up different structures to sort of negotiate those disagreements, and sort of collectively we all have to get along on some level. How are we going to negotiate that? So one version of that might be a kind of a deliberative democracy where we're going to, like, talk it out, and another version might be some kind of autocracy where somebody with more or less public legitimacy will just sort of tell everybody else what to do. And there's various other versions of this, but there's sort of a clear acknowledgement that politics in a way is sort of working out how to coordinate the lives of diverse folk. And so it's not shocking that people disagree in politics. One of the things that's interesting about something like parkour is that pretty much everybody does agree that a bench is for sitting on, and then somebody comes along and shows a completely different possibility for a bench, and suddenly you can see that possibility was there all along, but nobody had seen it until that person did that thing. And I mean, this I think touches back on our conversation about art, where I don't want to make any generalizations about art, but one thing I might say that a lot of great art does is help you see possibilities that you didn't realize were there before. And the stuff about authenticity, I think, is more in that vein. It's less about, it's not like every disagreement is this moment of existential anxiety. It's more that there can be these strange, and the parkour example is nice just because it's literally very concrete. But you can see this sort of thing happen, like people who are really emotionally intelligent, there's a version of thinking about ethics that treats ethics as a kind of, here's a problem, what do you do? And I think one of the problems with thinking about ethics in that way is that so much of what is really profound ethically is the creativity of the person who sees in a situation a different possibility. Because Desmond Tutu is on my mind. There's a lovely story about, I'm not going to get this right, but basically, a bunch of like heavily armed white soldiers or police coming into the church where he's preaching, and saying, that, you think that the power is on your side, but I'm a servant of God who is far more powerful than you. and then smiles and says, so since you've already lost, you might as well join us. And it's that sort of, that ability to, I mean, I think people like Tutu, one of the things that were great about them was the way that he could see possibilities. It wasn't like the correct thing to do here is to smile and invite them to join us, but rather he could see in this very tense situation an opening that other people couldn't see, in the same way that, well, not the same way, but in a way that's maybe distantly related to the way that, the parkour runner can see this possibility in a bench that nobody else has seen. And that's different from just saying two people are going to disagree about politics. It's about having that sort of moment of insight where you can take it in a direction that nobody else thought to take it.
Well, I have to say that's quite a powerful example. But it also goes to show why men like Desmond Tutu is so exceptional. I mean, most people wouldn't be able to do that. Yeah, to see that kind of possibility, it's in such a tense and really, high conflict scenario. Yeah. Santosh, you got something to ask? Okay. So I actually also want to ask you this thing, right? Because we talk about existential anxiety, and how I like how you defined it. It's kind of like it's the recognition that it doesn't have to be this way. You mentioned it just now, that nothing in terms of the structure of ourselves or the structure of the world necessarily has to dictate to us how we must live. And so in that sense, it goes along with the existential philosophy of radical freedom, right? That we have that this way of exercising our autonomy in the world. At the same time, I'm also like going back to some of the things we're talking about, thinking of how the conditions of the world also compel us to behave in certain ways. So yes, we are right now both, all three of us are talking on Zoom and having this really fruitful, productive discussion on philosophy. But I could be at the same time maybe trying to, instead of doing this, trying to spend time to enrich myself financially, or could be just scrolling TikTok, mindlessly. So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that, to me, right, some people are going to say that the way that we are doing this, engaging in this conversation, as a way to kind of pontificate, to philosophize about our anxiety. I mean, they may see it as not contributing, as in it's actually contributing to anxiety, because the more that we talk about it, the more we engage in not ameliorating our anxiety. I mean, I'm curious as to what your response is.
Yeah, I think this is one of the things that is just really hard. In life in general, this question, is the thing I'm doing the thing I want to be doing, the thing I ought to be doing? Or is it something I'm doing as a way of not doing the thing I want to be doing or the thing I ought to be doing? And, we're really good at fooling ourselves about this. And there is no formula for checking yourself. Partly because there is no formula for, oh, this is what I should be doing, right? I mean, if I could just sort of crunch out, oh, this is what I should be doing, life would be easy. But I find this even with, stuff that clearly is important to me, that, I have like on reflection endorsed as valuable. At times I will feel like, right now the thing I should be doing is like really studying Heidegger. And then there will be moments where I might think, wait a minute, I'm using this idea that studying Heidegger is really valuable as an excuse to get away from this other thing that really is what's on my mind. One way I like to think about this is, if you're in a city, the tallest building in that city is usually not visible because there are other buildings that are closer that are in the way. And it's like, on one hand, there's sort of, which building is tallest in an absolute sense? And then there's a question of which building is tallest in my field of vision. And I think we can often kind of end up being fooled into prioritizing what's largest, what looms largest in our field of vision, and failing to sort of see what is actually largest. And yeah, I think that applies to, what we're doing right now, among other things. I think talking about philosophy is important and it's valuable. But yeah, I don't think, I think the only real antidote, and I don't think it's even an antidote, is just constant vigilance. Check yourself. Except that also could be part of the problem. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, because it relates well to your essay, right? And it's the one where you leverage on the writings of Sartre, Kierkegaard, and Heidegger. And I'm going to quote your conclusion here. Anxiety has liberatory potential, but it doesn't make it fun. It's hard work. It runs against our natural grain to unshackle ourselves from familiar ways of inhibiting the world. In recommending anxiety as a valuable teacher, basically four philosophers, these three philosophers offer a counterbalance to the relentless positivity that's become one of the US chief cultural exports. So, like I feel like what you're doing here is quite valuable, well, breaking the spell work actually, because in a world where it's true, where, the best sellers are on positive thinking, how to make yourself, how to increase your level of happiness, you're actually, turning the other cheek, so to speak, and you're actually saying that perhaps the better solution, preferred solution, is to work on getting comfortable with anxiety. And I guess what I'm curious to ask from you is, do you have like a personal example you can offer about how this has worked out for you, or other people who have taken up that kind of, exercise?
My life is a mess, so maybe I'm not arguing why you shouldn't do what I say. What's a good personal example?
Well, first thing, are you convinced by, this turn of, this cottage industry of positive thinking, and I mean, there are even philosophers who also try to dive into that kind of industry to produce books about how we can use philosophy to increase our level of happiness.
Yeah. There's a philosophical question about, what is the greatest good? It seems like this is sort of a question that kind of almost every philosopher in every tradition asks in some way, like, what should we be doing? And then there's the question of like, how do we realize it? And I feel like we live in an age, there's in the mid 20th century, there was this I'm blanking on his name, C.P. Snow, and this talk about two cultures, this sort of the humanistic culture and the science culture, and the humanistic world was sort of giving way to a world shaped by science. I feel like we're not in a world that's shaped by science, but a world that's shaped by engineering. Like the great heroes today are not like scientists like Einstein. They're computer programmers. They're engineers. Or Elon Musk, sort of the greatest engineer of them all. And what engineers do is they find very efficient solutions to set problems. So in a way, I feel like a lot of like positive psychology is, and people talk about this in terms of like literally in terms of life hacks of, how can we engineer a solution to this? The goal is happiness. How do we engineer the solution? And the job of the philosopher isn't to say how do we engineer the solution, but rather what should the goal be? And if you've decided before we even start that the goal is a certain kind of psychological positivity, in a way, that's a way of refusing to do philosophy. It's a way of saying, the philosophy is done, now let's engineer the solution. And I feel like, we haven't even started doing philosophy yet. And, I like being happy. I mean, there's something to be said for happiness, but I feel like, I'm much more interested in asking about goals than means, but that's maybe partly my temperament.
I think this also relates very well to Heidegger's interest in technology. So, from what I understand from quite a rudimentary level is that there's kind of like three tenets to his line of thought, right? Which is, one, technology is not just an instrument, but it's a way of understanding the world. Technology can develop beyond human control, and that it poses a certain danger, right, in influencing and shaping our way of seeing or relating to the world. And obviously our world is very different from the one that Heidegger grew up in, because now we've got smartphones, internet, computers, social media, and maybe the impending metaverse. But already Heidegger in the 1950s and 1960s was already warning that due to this age of technology, that we are going to increasingly see human beings and nature as raw materials for technological advancement or development. So I'm just wondering, like relating to what you just talked about just now, do you have any thoughts as to how we can apply that level of analysis to our everyday interactions with technology? And what was Heidegger's, kind of way of addressing this?
Yeah, it's interesting actually, and that's one. I mean, I feel Nietzsche is another example of somebody where you sort of read them like warning about like, look out, there's this thing that is happening, and you sort of think like, wow, what do they make of where we are now? Because we've gone a long way down that road. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's maybe worth emphasizing about, I mean, Heidegger, one of the reasons Heidegger is really difficult is that he's very abstract. Heidegger's not the person you turn to for like, here's my commentary on what was in the news today. So for instance, when he talks about technology, in some sense he is talking about, the sorts of things like smartphones or cars or whatever else, but he's really more, he immediately kind of traces it back to its Greek root in this word techne, and he's more interested in a kind of an overall mindset, a way of engaging with the world that maybe is like very clearly characterized by what we typically would call technology, but he's sort of interested in something kind of a little more universal and all-embracing. And one sort of fundamental way of thinking about it is, first of all, in terms of thinking of the world in terms of resources to be exploited, that the stuff around me is stuff to be used, and stuff to be kind of grasped and manipulated. And Heidegger was saying this, well before corporations had departments called human resource. But there's something I think really telling in the phrase human resources, in the sense that you're treating human beings as resources for producing outputs. And it sort of says something about just how profound this way of thinking is, that we can even talk about human resources, let alone natural resources. But yeah, in a way his concern was like not simply like, put down your smartphone, kids, but our whole way of engaging, not just with the world, but with ourselves, of making sense of ourselves, is a way of treating ourselves as a sort of an efficiency maximizing engine. And until you get off that treadmill, you can't even see that there is a treadmill that you're on. And part of one of the things Heidegger talks about also in that connection, he has this whole story to tell in his later philosophy about how there are different ways of kind of different epochs frame the world, different ways in which they relate to things as a whole. This is maybe another answer to your question of, why read the ancients? Heidegger has, at a number of points, he appeals to the Greeks. There's this essay on the origin of the work of art where he talks about a Greek temple as not just sort of this structure, but somehow a way of relating earth to heaven to the human. It's a way of sort of making sense of how we are in the world that is just radically different from what buildings do today. And that you find in Greek architecture sort of a manifestation of the spirit of that age, in the same way that in contemporary technology you find a manifestation of the spirit of our age. And it's it's so much the water that we're swimming in that we can't even sense that it's there. And like one of the things Heidegger wants to do is try in various ways to get us to be more aware, first of all, of the water that we're swimming in, and also to make us think this water is getting awfully polluted. And so, yeah, I think technology is sort of, technology in the way we ordinarily use the term is sort of one small part of this much bigger picture that he wants to talk about, just how we relate to ourselves in the world in terms of kind of resource exploitation, that he thinks is bad, not just because we're going to ruin the environment, but because we're ruining ourselves spiritually in some sense by treating ourselves as resources.
Did he see a way out of this, or was he kind of just, being an analyst, but he didn't kind of see a way for us to get out of this fix?
There's this famous interview he gave toward the end of his life where he says, only a God can save us.
Wow.
And one of the things that's, I think, later Heidegger, so Heidegger's hard. Being in Time, this book that he wrote in the 1920s, which is sort of like the main work that, he stands up, is hard. And then in his later work, he goes off on these things that are even harder. And this is where he starts talking about technology and stuff. But, in a lot of these writings, it's like he's trying to write his way out of the predicament we find ourselves in. And it's not like he's saying, hey, everybody, here's what you need to do. But something more like, this act of writing is my way of trying to find my way out of the mess that I find myself in. And maybe some sympathetic souls will read this, and for them too, it will be some sort of way out. But he certainly doesn't have any kind of programmatic or global, here's what you need to do. But in a sense, for a lot of, especially again, for the later Heidegger, there's a sense that looking for a solution is part of the problem. That saying like, what's the solution to this problem? You're already thinking in a kind of a technological vein of like, how do I get from point A to point B? And in a way, he wants to say, step back from all of that. And it's not that then you're going to find an answer to your question, but rather somehow the way in which you're framing questions is going to change. And that's the sort of the important work that needs to happen.
Wow. Yeah, I think this actually goes well with what I wanted to quote also from what I learned from your writing. So I'm just going to quote you here because I think it kind of goes along with the same message. Because you said that, to really think of finding a solution, that's really the problem. So you're right. The desire to transcend the human, i.e. to end the heartache, and in the context of a conversation, to kind of like get rid of suffering, bewilderment, existential anxiety is deeply human. But in their different ways, Wittgenstein and Heidegger teach us to recognize our inclination to self-bafflement precisely in the desire to eliminate the possibility of that self-bafflement. What we need is not to transcend the everyday, but to inhabit it honestly and without rebuff. In overcoming our aversion to our everyday existence, we accept it as authentically our own. And in bringing us back to the everyday, both of them, they do not want to resolve our confusions definitively, but on the contrary, to wean us off the hope that such a resolution is available to us. And so, in your conclusion, you're kind of like saying that our impulse to think philosophically is just deeply a inalienable feature of what it means to be human. And I was just wondering, relating back to your interest in animals. I mean, do you see all this as kind of like maybe it's our own biological structure as an animal? Like we are born with a certain brain, a certain structure, a certain body, certain genes, and that comes with a certain psychology and behavior. And especially in this context, right? Like we're talking about technology, and there are people out there who want us to transcend these limitations, right? They're envisioning a post or transhumanistic future scenario. I mean, do you think these traits are just irresolvable? We are forever going to be fixated with anxiety, self-bafflement, and yeah.
I mean, as long as we're human, I feel like, trans post-human visions, it's so hard to see beyond a certain horizon what that might be. There's only so far I can get away from being what I am and still understand what that means. I'm not especially interested in it. I mean, I am in a way. I'm kind of curious, and I find that this sort of the form of thought really interesting. But I'm not gonna not be human, right? Like I don't, on a very simple level, I just don't think the pace of technological change, rapid as it is going to be such that there's going to be options open to me beyond dying as a biological organism sometime in the next 60 odd years. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting about what I find, at least in Heidegger and Wittgenstein, I should say first of all, I'm hugely flattered by how much of my stuff you've read. So that came from the introduction to this book on Wittgenstein and Heidegger, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the things I think is really valuable about them is that, on one hand, yeah, I think they paint a pretty compelling picture of how philosophizing is an inescapable part of being human, and also that philosophizing doesn't come to a satisfactory conclusion, that it is part of our predicament that we will reflect, and that's for better and for worse, however you want to put it.
Santosh, you want to jump in before I ask the next? Okay, cool. Okay, yeah.
No, I think so. What came to my mind was so I'm on a personal journey of rewilding my mind and decolonizing my mind and deindustrializing my mind. So it's just based on a principle that I learned from Peter Levine. He's the founder of somatic experiencing, or bodily experiencing, embodiment practices, and what he learned as he was studying wild animals and domesticated animals, that wild animals don't have PTSD, whereas domesticated animals of the same kind, they have PTSD. And that's quite provocative in the sense that actually what we need to do is to actually just be a bit wilder and be a bit more comfortable with the discomforts of life. Yeah. And not just focus entirely on positives, but embracing the negatives. And the entire mindfulness-based stress reduction MBSR movement, founded by John Kabat-Zinn, is also based on this premise of the moment-to-moment experience in the present moment, and just being with it, yeah, and accepting the moment for what it is, and yeah, just being in a state of contentment, yeah, and that gives a sense of inner peace that's quite beautiful, and it's a practice, yeah. So that's yeah, those are two things that came to my mind, because I think a lot of my rewilding journey and practice is, and the anxiety that I'm trying to clear is because I resisted negative emotions like anger, sadness, grief, probably. Yeah. So these are like emotions and feelings that in a domesticated setting and in a civilized setting, we are told not to feel and not to embrace. You know, we're told to be happy and to look content and all of that. And so the other end and the other pole needs to be embraced. And the discomfort of that, when it's integrated, it allows us to become more whole human beings, more whole and integrated human beings. And that's where the anxiety, the existential anxiety that we're talking about, reduces significantly. Yeah. So actually, it's a practice, embodied practice that can reap tremendous rewards for those who just go on the mindfulness-based stress reduction journey, or the somatics or the embodiment experiencing journey. Yeah. So
I'm curious what you make of that, David. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of, is it Peter Levy, did you say?
Peter Levine, yeah.
Levine,
so
yeah.
He's a trauma expert. Yeah, so trying to understand why trauma exists in societies and in individuals. Yeah, he's a psychotherapist. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I mean, not familiar with him, but you know, one significant chunk of my interest in this whole animals business is, yeah, sort of recognizing that there's this sort of animal organism here that, you know, as interested in your term rewilding, that you know, basically, you know, haven't changed a whole lot in my basic evolutionary structure in the last, you know, 200,000 years or whatever. That there's sometimes these moments of like, what is this African ape doing on the west coast of Canada? Let alone the fact, you know, like much more recent, like what is this person of, you know, European descent doing on the west coast of North America? And I mean, you know, oof, and there's a, you know, there's a whole long story to be explored here as well. You know, you also mentioned about, you know, decolonizing your mind and what wisdom there is to be learned from, you know, the original inhabitants of this part of the world, and also how much has been lost through, you know, the displacement and suppression of their ways of life and their ways of thinking. You know, there's is it Aldous Huxley? Somebody has this sort of notion of a perennial philosophy, but you know, various thinkers have sort of noticed, like, you know, look at, like, you know, the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible and, you know, the Tao Te Ching, and you find all these like sort of threads across, you know, human thought. And it's like, well, yeah, a lot of common threads across Eurasian agricultural societies. And, you know, the human mind and human behavior just seems so much more plastic than we're able to imagine. And I think kind of recognizing how many different ways there are to be human is tremendously rewarding and enriching.
Wow, we've gone really long, but I hope I can just keep you for another 10 minutes, David. Is that okay? Yeah, so it's just really just to kind of conclude with a few questions, because some of your other essays, they're really interesting stuff, and I think it's a good way to kind of end our conversation. So obviously, one very consistent message you have in your work is about how philosophy is just something that we all do. In your particular essay about whether philosophers are experts, you actually use the analogy of philosophy as acting. It's like something that we all think that we do, so we all act, or we think that we can act. It's very ubiquitous. requires low intellectual effort, but there's such a thing as an acting school. So, and those are not fraudulent or scams. So just like with philosophy, there is a certain method to getting it better, and to have a much more constructive way of doing philosophy. And then of course there's the other essay that you have, which I just alluded to much earlier in our conversation, about how Donald Trump's victory shows why we need philosophy students more than ever. So I guess I got one fun question for you, which is why aren't we living in a world where philosophers are not perceived to be as valuable as actors and paid maybe as much as a Hollywood actor? And what has actually happened in this case, where we don't value philosophers or thinkers who do their job well? They're not placed or esteemed in terms of a social level of status.
Yeah, wow, that would be a different world, wouldn't it? I mean, I feel there's a number of answers to that question. One is the market only tracks a certain kind of value. There are a lot of, philosophy is one thing, right? I mean, another is, one of the most valuable activities in human society is raising children. And this is labor that is predominantly undertaken by women, and they aren't paid for it. I would say the problem isn't that, mothers and philosophers should get paid, but the problem is that we accord prestige according to pay. There's a lovely book by Lewis Hyde called The Gift, which sort of draws on this distinction between a gift economy and a market economy. And like part of the point of a market economy is it's in a sense zero sum. That like if I'm going to give you $50 for a shirt, we've agreed that that shirt has this value, and like we come out the same. Like you get the $50, I get the shirt, and they're of the same value. And so like in a market economy, everything is sort of exchanged equally. Whereas a gift economy is something that grows. That when I give you a gift, it's not zero sum. That what I have given away is less than what you receive. And I think that's, a wonderful model of parenting, right? That, how can I repay the gift to my parents? The whole point is that it was a gift, you don't repay it. There's no way you can repay it. And, likewise with philosophy, I would like to say, it's, there are various ways, I think this is true of teaching, and I would have to do something else with my life if you didn't get paid to teach. But I'm not in it for the money, Lord knows I can be making a lot more money doing something else. And I'm glad that there's enough money that I can support myself sometimes. But it operates on a different logic than the logic of a market. And I think that's a good thing for a couple of reasons. One is you don't want to commodify it. I think there'd be something wrong with commodifying things that are of great value. And also, if philosophers were paid as much as actors and professional athletes, just think how much bullshit there would be. That if there was like tremendous prestige to be gained from being a philosopher, every charlatan would jump in to try to claim the mantle of philosophy. And I just think we'd be swimming in pretension, and that would be bad. So maybe it's just as well that there aren't huge social rewards for pretending you're wise. I mean, there are. But it'd be even worse if people got paid a lot of money.
Actually, that reminds me of cult leaders, people who profess to pretend to be wise, but clearly are not, and are in it for the money. So, and because I've been reading a book about this, so it's quite amazing about how it's due to the use of language, like the way cult leaders build their supporters. It's through a certain very deceptive use of language, like how they co-opt terms from, say, religious texts, using words like blessed, and through such keywords, right? It gives the people, their followers, a sense of like they're following something or doing something sacred, like say a CrossFit workout. So yeah. But you just hit the you just brought the keyword I wanted to bring up, which is bullshit. And you wrote that essay calling bullshit. And I guess I read it and I had a very unexpected reception of it, because you I guess in the end rebuked the idea of calling bullshit. You think that calling bullshit basically, as you're putting from you here, puts an abrupt stop to the conversation, and like bullshitting itself, it can encourage us to stop thinking, ready to think further. And I understand where you're coming from, but wouldn't it be nice if we just call bullshit on certain things that are just way too obvious, like Trump and his rhetoric? Yeah, I mean, isn't there a certain moral standard for that?
Yeah, I mean, so part of it is that like there's a man bites dog story there, right? Like if I were to say bullshit is bad, that's not exactly going to draw headlines. So, more interesting to say actually calling bullshit is bad. I mean, the main thought there, and actually maybe I could tie this into Trump. The main thought there is, I think it ties back to the stuff I was saying earlier about, that danger of saying, the way you think the world is, well, that's exactly the way the world is. There can be a kind of a posture of being like the bullshit caller, like, I'm not fooled, which can be a way of not thinking. And in particular, I feel like there can be a sort of a smug dismissal of certain points of view that just comes too easily. And one of the things I talk about in that article is also the way, there's this sort of story about a dispute between the philosophers Rudolf Carnap and Martin Heidegger, where Carnap basically tries to call bullshit on Heidegger. This is sort of one of those like kind of epic moments in the history of analytic and continental philosophy. And, as somebody with some continental sympathies, I sort of want to stand up for bullshit. But one problem I think with politics in general is I think it makes most people stupid. I feel like my political insights, such as they are just not very interesting. Like I don't think they're terrible. I don't think it's useless and it's important to think about philosophy, but I don't think I'm being like my wisest or my most insightful when I talk about politics. And I think very few are the people who are like genuinely politically insightful, but everybody has an opinion. And while listing the outrages of Donald Trump is maybe a satisfying exercise, there's maybe also a danger there of kind of, and this is, this isn't quite the rage argument. This is slightly different, but I think that we're in an age that is addicted to outrage. And I think there's something profoundly problematic about outrage. There's a lovely line in Homer in the Iliad where he talks about it as honey dripping down the throat. And I think that one of the secrets, the dirty secret about outrage, is it's intensely pleasurable. But people deny themselves this. They sort of act as if they're deeply aggrieved, but there's something so satisfying. Because outrage is basically a way of saying, a lot of life is messy and complicated, but here's a case where no question, they're wrong, I'm right. And there's something so satisfying in a life that is so full of confusion and doubt and uncertainty. I'm right, you're wrong. And Trump has this really powerful ability to bring that out in people, both people in support of him and people against him. And I think everybody just becomes dumber through outrage. And this is, I think, connected to sort of the bullshit thing, right? That someone who calls bullshit is just so confident that I'm right, you're wrong. And, sometimes you are right and the other person is wrong. But I think there's a danger of getting addicted to that feeling of rightness. And that's kind of what I'm fighting against in the calling bullshit thing. I think there's a danger in being too pleased with your own calling bullshit, in the same way that there's a danger in giving too much of your attention to outrage. And unfortunately, lately, it's been hard not to.
Yeah, wow, I like that. Like you brought in Homer, so it relates back to our earlier theme about reading ancient texts, finding something there relevant, and bringing it back to contemporary times. And yeah, I think also the way you talk about rage, perhaps is also, well, at least from the way I'm looking at it right now, it's the way you describe it, like it's sort of a sweet sensation, right? That feeling of feeling satisfied and smug about it. And I guess it relates to being as well. Like you want to feel that way. And in that sense, you don't feel any doubt about your own values and your own attitudes towards the world. But maybe instead, what we should do is be a little bit more skeptical and a little bit more inquisitive about trying to make sense of how we relate to people, how we relate to the world. And yeah, perhaps we don't have all the answers. And the best thing we should try to do is philosophize a little more deeper and thoroughly and richer. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like my takeaway. Santosh, got any last things you'd like to say before we close? Okay. Yeah. So okay.
Yeah, I think it's good.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, David. I think this has been really, really fruitful. I know we jumped around quite a lot, but I really like how we kind of flowed. There's something there in terms of the theme and just of the thread of our conversation. And yeah, I definitely am going to leave this conversation thinking a little bit deeper about philosophy and literature.
Yeah, I mean, thank you again for, indulging my long-winded replies, but also, I'm really touched by just, how much how much background you dived into, and the questions were terrific. So, I really appreciate both of you for inviting me on.
Yeah, no worries. It's a pleasure. It's a shame we couldn't get through talking about your traveling. But perhaps there will be another time, and I can invite you back on the show for something else to talk about. So let's see if that happens. And
Maybe I'll get
and
to
again,
Singapore again.
yeah. And again, just for our viewers to know, again, just advertise yourself a little bit about your causes and what you do, so our viewers know where to reach you.
Thanks. Yeah. So eganphilosophy.com is the website, EGAN philosophy.com. And yeah, that's got a bunch of stuff about me, but kind of what I've been doing lately is teaching online philosophy courses to the general public. So I've got a couple of classes that are starting in mid-January, and I don't know when this is going to go online, but it might be late for that. But look at the website. There's lots of things. You can also on the website sign up to a mailing list where I have monthly newsletters as well as other bits and bobs where I'll also share ideas. There's also, if you look up David Egan Philosophy on Facebook, there's a Facebook page as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we are going to have this video out by this weekend, but I think by the time people view this, it might be a bit too late. But sign up for the mailing list, stay in touch with David, and I'm sure you'll get a chance to learn from him. Thanks so much, everyone, and calling it close. Yeah.